So the theme of our today's session is Beyond Text, what a material turn is a theory of history of international law. So we can see that history of international law has long been studied has long been dominated by intellectual history and the specter of global hierarchies and inequalities. And by engaging today with a new materialism, so this seminar can mirror a new historiography of global governments. So I'm very much honored to have here Daniel Quiroga Villamarin and Dr. Daniel Joyce. So the speaker is Daniel Ricardo Quiroga Villamarin, so he was recently visiting researcher at the Harvard Law School's Institute for Global Law and Policy. And so Daniel did a BA in law at Bogota. So he's currently studying international law at the Institut de Haute École Internationale et du Développement in Geneva. So his research focused on the intersection of history, critical law theory, and international law. He published many articles, reviews, and books chapters on transitional justice, social rights, human rights, and the question of sovereignty and extra sovereignty. And in his personal description on Twitter, he's writing Esperando la Revolución. So Dr. Daniel Joyce will provide this commentary. So thank you very much, Dr. Daniel Joyce. And so Dr. Daniel Joyce is a senior lecturer and directorate of research in Sydney at UNSW Law. He was affiliated to many research, and he's affiliated research at the University of Helsinki, member of the academic board of the Cambridge Journal of International Law, and he also practices as a barrister in New South Wales. And interestingly, for our session today in 2018 with Jesse Homan, he edited International Law Objects. So I would like to start this session by quoting Daniel Joyce and Jesse Homan in the introduction, so with a few sets of questions. So what might we learn about international law if we began with objects, things, and material culture? What might be believed about the way international law is made and the way it works? What might we see if we took seriously international law's role in constructing the world, claiming and disclaiming parts of it, vesting things with authority or stripping them of legitimacy? And what might we learn about objects themselves if we allow them to speak more clearly to us, if we let them take center stage rather than treating them as peripheral to or as passive probes for human actions? So I think that these questions open perfectly discussions on the material turn in history of international law. So Daniel will be presenting one of his chapter of his thesis, and then Daniel Joyce will provide a commentary, and then we will have also a time for questions. So Daniel, the floor is yours. Yeah.
I just wanted to thank again Sophie for this great introduction and for all the work she has done for this seminar, podcast, making the flyers, convening all our spectacular lineup of speakers, and banning trolls when necessary. I also want to thank Daniel for taking the time in the midst of this very confusing and complex times. I also want to start by putting this chapter in context. It is part of my master's dissertation, which deals with shipping containers in the history of international law. And here I will basically present a mostly methodological or historiographical argument. And I say that because I know a lot of you might be interested in questions of materiality that I really discussed in the next chapter of my dissertation, or in the particular object that I'm studying, which is shipping containers. But sadly, my argument only comes into the last chapter. So I begin the text with two epigraphs that frame a little bit the way I want to make this argument. On the one hand, Sam Moyne on the fact that intellectual history has never really reckoned with the implications of social theory and perhaps critical theory more broadly. And on the other, a very interesting book review of Ellen Wood of Quentin Skinner that I think frames a little bit precisely the debates I want to map between Marxism and intellectual history. So the context in which the chapter emerges is not only a return to history in international law that has been widely celebrated for the last couple of decades, but perhaps more precisely, a turn to historiography that has happened in the last couple of years. And Nordford noted that perhaps it's more precisely to talk about a turn to history as method. Harry Simpson notes an obsessive concern with historical method, own little white genocide fiasco, remembering the conversation we had with Derek Moses a couple of weeks ago with the Jamestown article in the Journal of the History of International Law and the recent conference they did on the politics of the history of international law. And this all shows a very interesting and growing interest in the history of the histories of international law. And in fact, historiography as such is not particularly new for a field. And here I cite perhaps one of the most recent and more interesting historiographic type of arguments that have been done in the literature. However, that I want to do here is a little bit different from the ones I have cited above, because what I want to show and most importantly critique is that a particular methodological approach that one could describe between an intellectual history a la Quentin Skinner or the Cambridge School and a conceptual history a la Koselleck has come to dominate the field. Not in vain, Juan Pablo Scarfe, an Argentinian colleague, has described international legal history as the intellectual history of legal ideas in international relations. And Prakbar Singh, also a participant in our seminar that we'll be discussing his own work in progress later in June, says that it goes without saying that much of the scholarship takes direct instructions from the Cambridge School. Now, I want to be absolutely clear. I'm not suggesting that intellectual history or conceptual histories lacked any critical potential. In fact, I think there's much and a lot of very interesting work to be done on the intellectual history of international law of many, many, many sorts of questions. I have myself used this approach, and Sophie kindly shared one of my previous papers in the website. But however, I have been, and moreover, it's also important to show that the importance that these methodological tools have had to challenge, let's say, liberal and idealist narratives of progress in the history of international law. And I don't want to diminish that enormous importance. However, as David Koenig and Sam Moyn have reminded us, one of the problems is that when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And it seems to me there are problems in our contemporary world that cannot be solved with the hammer of intellectual history. I am particularly concerned by what I could call the displacement thesis, and it's an argument that I'm borrowing from the history of human rights, which was really my field until a couple of months ago. And it's that perhaps all of this enthusiasm about intellectual history may have eclipsed other ways of doing history, just as human rights might have displaced other vocabularies of doing social justice. And in particular, I'm interested in seeing how intellectual history might have been very effective at moving more Marxist or materialist, broadly understood, approaches to international legal thesis. So in short, if Marxist scholarship, and here I quote Mutusu, has denounced international law for its idealism, its insufficient engagement with the concrete materiality of political and economic power, well, what I want to do is to do something similar, but for the history of our field, perhaps for exactly the same problems. So, as I told you, I will tell this story as a narrative, perhaps ironically, of the intellectual history of intellectual history. So I begin this story in what I would like to call the reception of the linguistic turn in the history of ideas. Now, this is quite difficult because if you see Pocock, one of the famous founders of the Cambridge School, really himself considered that there's no thing as the Cambridge School because there are too many methods that are too diverse to be associated and clumped within one single school. And if you add into the mix the German history of concepts and the French history of mentalities with the Foucauldian and the Foucauldian genealogical and archaeological type of scholarship, it seems very difficult to identify any single type of school. But what I want to do is that something that all of these different intellectual movements have in common is they were forged in the discussions or the crucible of interaction between traditional national history or history of ideas and the linguistic turn 60s and 70s. So what I'm trying to say is that they share what Foucault would call an attitude, or what the Australian legal theorists would call an ethos, Davis would call an ethos, that is a particular set of approach to the discursive formations at hand. And most importantly, I want to showcase that both these three moments that I want to study are all part of a similar set of two wars against idealist histories on the one hand, that we could call Platonic, and social and materialistic histories on the other side. So what I'm trying to say is that this type of intellectual history or this type of linguistical influence history would have to fight these two sorts of opponents and this would happen again when their methodology comes to legal history and to international legal history. So perhaps ironically, of course, the linguistic turn is in itself a contested and polysemic idea. And some of you might recriminate me for trying to put a lot of very different things together in what I call the linguistic turn. Basically, I am taking this as an ideal type, and I'm just trying to say that it was a fair movement in social sciences and the humanities that tried to show that language was constitutive of intellectual and social life. And this happened in many different ways, in many different fields, from Anglo-American analytic philosophy to continental hermeneutics, critical theory, and what is called problematically French theory. But what I want to show in particular is that history was also very active in this conversation. And as Sewell noted in his Logics of Histories, well, really the 60s and 70s were a period of tremendous effervescence in these questions of method, side by side, social sciences and history. So what is the so-called Cambridge School in this light? So a textbook introduction, and here I'm citing Richard Whatmore, will usually tell you that basically this was a movement that wanted to challenge the tradition of German idealism that was so prevailing in the history of ideas. And here, of course, the bête noire is Arthur Lovejoy, and his work, The Great Chain of Being, in which he is, the way he formulates the problem is that there's a single conceptual horizon that perhaps might change in different contexts and times, but it remains with a certain kind of essence that remains in all of these places. And basically the Cambridge School usually tells itself as an attack against this. So what they wanted to do was to draw from linguistic analyses and the linguistic turn to try to challenge this acontextual and eternal view of conceptual immutability, to rather show that ideas were political weapons that were deployed by particular actors in particular places for particular purposes. As Skinner would put it in his 1969 path-breaking article, Meaning and Understanding in the History of Ideas, there is no history of the idea to be written, but only a history necessarily focused on the various agents who use the idea and the varying situations and intentions. And this is interesting because this perhaps phrasing will almost migrate verbatim to one of Koskiniemi's recent works on the history of history of human rights law. So here we have an enormous influence of Austin on the one hand and Wittgenstein on the other. And what we see is a very, very intense preoccupation for the study of performative utterances. And this, of course, has its own intellectual history in its own merit. I am here just briefly summarizing what was very important for this type of new historians to bring into the fray. I think a very interesting way to see it, this excerpt from Quentin Skinner's one of his recent books on Machiavelli, in which he says, look, if you really want to understand Machiavelli and what Machiavelli meant with lo Stato, you really need to go to the linguistic context of early modern Florence and see the ways in which mantenere lo Stato was deployed, etc., and not assume that he's talking about the state, as most of first-year political science students are taught by their professors in most places around the world. Now, so in some way I want to say is that this method of the so-called Cambridge School, really what they wanted to do was to historicize a text in its context that showed how its meaning was created in the exercise of political struggle and critique of authority. And for this reason, intellectual history usually frames its own history as an attack against what Pocock, the doctoral supervisor, Butterfield, called the Wick interpretation of history, this grand narrative of evolution and progression. And along with Pocock, Skinner, Dunn, and some of the people we already cited, and some of the ones we will see a little bit later, like LaCapra and White, we have a very important movement towards this new type of intellectual history from the late 50s, but in particular in the 60s and 70s. So what I want to note here that I think is often not told in the textbook introductions is that this was not the only mythological battle that these new historians had to wage. In fact, there are many types of criticisms to Platonic idealism, and one that was perhaps the conceptual antithesis of intellectual history, just to quote Hyde and White, was of course historical materialism. And we have a very strong fight in this debate in this time, not only between the Cambridge historians and the, let's say, Arthur Lovejoy types of Platonic idealistic history, but also against the British tradition of historical materialism, which was, of course, very strong at this time. So this is not to say that Marxists disregard the importance of ideas. Marx's introduction to the critique of the philosophy of right tell us that we are all contemporaries of the present without being its historical contemporaries. Foucault has, of course, recognized the importance of Marx in doing history, Skinner as well. But the real question here is, what is the relation between the material and the conceptual, or between consciousness and, let's say, social material orders? So Marx would tell us in his preface to the Critique of Political Economy that it's not the consciousness of men that determine their being, but rather their social being that determine their consciousness. And there's this very long debate in Western post-Marxism about what's the relationship between base and superstructure, and what does it mean to be determinate in the last instance. And these are not a series of debates that I really want to explore very, very profoundly here. I just want to show that the Cambridge method had to shape it as a two-way critique of both idealist and Marxism. And this debate would repeat itself, perhaps quoting Marx later on, not only as a farce. Now, in sum, what I want to show is that the way we usually tell the history of the Cambridge methods leaves half or more of the picture missing. And just to quote Moyne on this, if you put it in perspective, it shows that despite all the importance of Skinner, of course, the Cambridge school, the distance between them and the Lovejoys wasn't that much if you put it in conversation with Marxism. Of course, they were very mindful about context, but as Moyne says, not a lot of context. What really mattered was outside text and nothing but text. And this is an important point of controversy with Marxist thought. So eventually, this Cambridge method would be strongly adopted by the critical legal studies movement. Basically, the reception of the linguistic turn in United Statesian legal theory has been received in the wake of the realist legal theory of the early 20th century, and in particular by two later movements, the CLS and the Law and Society. I will not talk a lot about the Law and Society current, but rather I want to show how via that it is that Cambridge methods came to come into international law. And here, of course, the leading figure is the American historian, the United Statesian historian Robert Gordon, with two papers, Historicism in Legal Scholarship, 1981, Critical Legal Histories in 1984. I just want to note very quickly his acknowledgements to the work of Pocock in the footnote of Historicism in Legal Scholarship. Now, what Willis was trying to do was to critique what Gordon called the ways in which the American legal tradition repressed historicism. And this was something that he called initially adaptation theory and later evolutionary functionalism. It's basically the idea that all legal developments are merely but a reflection of what happens in society. So law is a mirror of social life. And when society changes, then law must change. And in particular, the idea of function that was also prevalent in comparative law at this time is crucial to this type of theories. So there's a function that must be met, and as society evolves and changes, the function changes, but really what matters is the society. And functionalism for CLS historians was very present in both the Marxist left, which usually told the development of law, of American law, and link it to the history of capitalism or the interest of the ruling class, etc. Or on the other hand, Whiggish liberal projects, which simply told an ideal progression of American legal system. And in this particular moment, what Gordon was trying to do would be to use the Cambridge methods to try to stress the indeterminacy of language. And this in particular was later picked up with all of its difference by Duncan Kennedy and other CLS historians in what they call the study of legal consciousness. And this was basically the idea that we must view law not as an instrument, which is the traditional Marxist approach, but rather as an undeterminate autonomous discourse that is used by active contexts. And basically, this is a challenge to both the triumphalist stories of liberal progress, but also what Duncan Kennedy called the fanatic adherence to some form of materialism or basis of pure thinking. Now, this came to international law. The way we usually tell this story is that it came to the structuralist scholarship of David Kennedy and Koskiniemi in the 80s. So of course, we have international legal structures from homology to top, that laid a bit the foundations of this peak indeterminacy in international law. And even if it has different places now into the questions of expertise in global governance or the issue of structural biases, it would be very important for this generation of historians to draw from this critique of indeterminacy in their own work. So, of course, we also have our own homegrown tradition of liberal progress historiographies. And this is a narrative that usually tells that after the Cold War, international law finally could display its full weight. Matt Craven, Sunja Pehuya, and Gary Simpson have written a brilliant book on recently. Now, in this age of global optimism, of course, eventually crumbled. And for some people, it was the late 90s with the Yugoslav war. For some people, it was later on with the Iraq war. But slowly but surely, critical scholars came to the realization that the promises that delivered international order were really not coming to fruit. And I just cite here a couple of examples in which historians or people who have been engaged in the history of international law or say explicitly that their disappointment with the system led them to go into history. And that's why some scholars talk of history as anxiety, as a relief of anxiety, other types of mechanisms. Basically, what is interesting for me is that this type of scholarship did a very similar move to the one that was done before. So for instance, Koskiniemi would show that his approach, and in particular in the Gentle Civilized Nations, was both different from the holistic histories of international law. He cited Retzloff, Histoire d'un principe de droit de l'homme, and also realist narratives, termination by power politics. And then that, of course, is Greuel's books of international law. Moyne, on the other hand, was a very similar movement, also as an attack of contextual and church history, also a critique of Marxist historiography of international neoliberalism. And just to paraphrase Janne Nichman, it seems to me that what the present time are doing is to use Foucault and Said to make an opening, to put a wedge between Plato's Republic and Marx's German ideology. Now, I refer to all of the debates we have had, disciplinary wars that have raised fear. What I want to show is that the debates between historians and lawyers regarding context have shown that the Cambridge method has been the implicit background rule that governs the question. This usually goes is that, but surely professionally starting attacking these new international legal historians by committing the sin of anachronism and not being as rigorous as they should in their own work. So international lawyers, in turn, that the particularities of law are too specific for a historian to understand. And I just put two quotes of Anne Orford showing how she thinks Mark Wasserwer on the one hand and Quinn Slobodian on the other are simply too simplistic of the richness of law. So of course, what happened? Historians in turn saying that critical international lawyers failed to grasp the nuances of constitutionalism. I do understand Jepahuya that I think that the infight critical international lawyers and historians in what is the meaning, what is the context for this and that passage really hasn't gotten us very far in the last couple of years. Instead, I want to go beyond this dichotomy of histories by lawyers and histories done by historians. And I think that this scenario is quite groundbreaking in that regard. And instead, trying to see that beyond or very strong disciplinary enclosures, there are a lot of subdisciplinary divisions of people doing very different and diverse work. And doing so, I agree with Lauren Benton that if we frame international history the only methodology in town, sideline a very rich tradition of social legal types of history. And that brings me very quickly to my trying to make bridges between, let's say, a more traditional Marxism and the work of Foucault or the post-structuralist scholars that have been very concerned with. I don't want to disregard the many movements of intellectual history. I think there has been a lot of munition that this methodology provided us to critique grand progress. But at the time, I do think that international lawyers cannot think that this is the only in fact, if we go through that the disputes between methodological approaches have been really the butter of every conversation, especially in the context of the right global history, the last 2 or 3 decades. And even more than a historian's law and a lawyer's law, what I see is that in global history, there is a mix of approaches that could be global history, global histories of science and technology. And I think or particularly I think that my work could better enrich itself by trying to understand those nuances and those differences. So in fact, what I want to do is to beyond the certainty of this is our little square or province of jurisprudence determined that we lawyers must inhabit and that space that historians must inhabit, and rather see how subdisciplinary conversation might be interesting. And in particular, I'm wondering how critical lawyers, whatever that is, and we can discuss that further, can understand many, many developments in the materialisms, in the humanities, in social theory, in history. So what I really want to show is that we can really engage with that and have a return of Marxism in the. So in the United States, Comlins has consistently defended the possibility of imagining a Marxist tradition of legal history to the left of CLS in international law. Quite very interesting work done by Marxists on the problem of false contingency. Even in global intellectual history itself, we have Marxists like Andrew Surrey calling for emphasis on on structural determination over contingency and heterogeneity. And with this, what I want to say is that I think that we have been enchanted for a very long time for Derrida's mantra in a power of the text. Now my supervisor is right in chastising me that of course didn't mean that only text has a lot of other material elements in which discourse carries meaning. That being said, I do think that the reception of Derrida and other of the and I do want to challenge that, as Foucault reminds us, texts are just one of the many types of institutional material supports which sustain meaning. And what I do in the next chapter is to review all of the varieties or the most interesting varieties that I find in new materialisms. And I here present a very brief table of contents of how the next chapter works, to try to see how legal scholarship could interact with them and what are the avenues this work could take. Particularly, my work is very much influenced by the last trend, what I would like to call a Foucauldian governmentality of things, drawing also from the insights of science and technology studies. I just conclude with this citation from Sheila Jasanoff, which I think really shows what I'm really trying to explore in my work in shipping containers. And it's how very banal and insignificant things, artifacts, infrastructures can act as not only tool makers, but more particularly rule makers in the global governance. My last conclusion is just, let me close with a very presentist concern. And it's, we're ironically having this conversation on the 13th of May, quite decades after the May 68 uprising in the West and beyond. And it seems to me that a lot of the thinkers that were influenced by this historical moment really tried to distance themselves from the Marxist tradition. And there's a conversation we can have later on about Foucault and the Maoists, etc. And I really feel that our present situation doesn't give us those luxuries. I think that our concerns, and in particular thinking of the development of the history of capitalism in the last couple of years, really shows that I think that the new scholarship is not content with showing complexity or autonomy on the determinacy, but we rather really want to see how does the structures and hierarchies of our unequal global governance shape our lives, past, present, and future. Thank you very much for your attention, and I very much look forward to Daniel's comments.
Well, look, thanks so much. It's a great pleasure to be invited to participate in this seminar, and I'd like to start by thanking Sophie and Daniel for the opportunity to be involved. In this time of anxiety, distraction, exhaustion, lockdown, it's refreshing to be able to connect with a new piece of scholarship of this quality and to think through some of the important issues and themes that Daniel raises in his chapter. So we've already heard from Daniel as to his motivations for this research, which forms part of his master's research. But I'd like to also set out briefly what I think he has achieved before I then pose some questions and offer some broader comments and provocations. So I think this is, and I think we all agree, or those who've read it agree that it's a really thoughtful and engaging text. I think it should be acknowledged that it's a chapter of high quality, signaling an important new voice in the field and fresh territory for international legal research. I finished the chapter full of enthusiasm for the different kinds of histories of international law still to be written, and also reminded of the utility of history as a method for international legal scholarship. As we've heard in the chapter, Daniel sets out to trace, in a sense, the emerging historiography of international law, and does this through setting out, I think, very usefully, the associated scholarship and debates, His analysis and linkages are crisp, and the chapter offers both an argument as to where next, which we've just heard, but also provides those new to the methods with a really useful summary of the debates and scholarship. And it's good to see how much of it there is actually as well, and how it's grown in recent time. So unsurprisingly, given his broader conclusion that international legal history can benefit not only from the stoushes between lawyers and historians that he sets out, but also their collaboration and transdisciplinary engagement. I think Daniel is, in my view, quite rare for the ease with which he is able to straddle both disciplines, and also for the lack of defensiveness on his part about doing so. And I think that's a real strength as a kind of an openness to the piece, which I think is really strong and to be commended. So in the first half, where he engages with the Cambridge School and debates within intellectual history more broadly, at least from an international legal perspective, it doesn't appear to me that Daniel cherry picks or simplifies those debates, but in a sense, what he does really usefully is to translate them for principally an international legal audience. The chapter then provides a nuanced and detailed account of the turn to history within international legal scholarship, whilst simultaneously, and I think quite bravely, critiquing the pioneers of that turn for offering up what has largely been intellectual history. So Daniel notes a failure in this sense on the part of international legal historians to keep up with developments within historiography elsewhere, namely within sort of the discipline of history, and also questions the claim, I guess, that Anne Orford and others have made, that international legal historiography must be distinct and, in a sense, must be judged on its own terms. And I think that's a really interesting point, although I take also the point that Daniel made, that Sundya Pahuja makes, which is that, look, to some degree, perhaps some of those engagements haven't been as productive as they might have been. I still think it's quite an important area to think through, and I think it's quite revealing in a sense of the sort of critical international legal sensibility. So these problems identified are in the paper or in the chapter linked to a range of, to a number of things. So the distinctive role of interpretation within legal practice, and I think that's an important factor. The pacing issue, or can we say lag, of much legal scholarship in relation to sort of quote unquote turns and trends within the social sciences. The therapeutic role played by writing history as a response to the disappointments for international lawyers of the post-Cold War period, and perhaps the nadir in which critical international legal scholarship found itself, having sort of successfully shown the indeterminacy of international legal argument. So an important theme in the chapter is, and this is something also raised, is how history and law account for context. For the Cambridge group, ideas were, I'm sort of roughly quoting from Daniel here, ideas were contextual weapons to be deployed in political contexts, where context for critical international lawyers has often meant asking questions about who wins and loses, what are the stakes and so on. So, and in seeing law as an argument rather than as a set of rules. And I think here both David Kennedy and Koskiniemi are sort of very notable in this respect. And also zoning in on who gets to decide, which is obviously a really important question for international lawyers, and whose interpretation and authority will be definitive in the context of a range of plausible alternatives. And obviously, a part of the disappointment of the sort of post-Cold War period was, in a sense, the realization that indeterminacy and, in a sense, the adversarial technique of much international legal advocacy in courts, in a sort of practical sense, essentially illustrates the validity of at least two arguments, right? Probably more. And so when, things get pointy, as Daniel suggests they are now, it's quite hard for international lawyers to engage, because in a sense they have to park their critical sensibility about the complexity of what's involved with a kind of a desire to clearly engage in the political moment. And I think that's something that Matt Craven, Susan Marks, Ralph Wild, and Gary Simpson discussed in relation to their engaging with the Iraq War. And also it's perhaps we're entering a similar moment now. I've already seen people who are kind of, proponents of, legal pluralism, for example, in the kind of context of Trump, sort of down that tool in particular to kind of say, like, we've got to, simplify things and kind of lay our cards on the table. So I think that an interesting kind of theme. So obviously for legal scholarship too, what context does, and there's a law in context movement, is it's a way to introduce the social, the political, and the cultural into an otherwise positivist account of law. And I guess that's maybe an area where history and law are a bit different. So I think it's also quite interesting to think generationally here. And I, for one, came to study law in the early triumphal 90s, before the disillusionment had fully set in. And I was just sort of thinking when I read this chapter how the way in which I was taught public international law even a decade ago is very different to how we now think about what we now term law in the global context at my law school, or comparative international law, or global law and policy today. And I think it's interesting as well to think of the ways in which we're sort of stretched into these new kind of sort of semantic descriptions of the field. So how will a new generation of scholars understand the prospects of international law, and what does the material, turn to the material, signify here? Perhaps also too, the turn to history and to the material reflects a kind of methodological eclecticism, and I would say also insecurity of international law. So that's something that law's grappled with as it's tried to kind of achieve legitimacy within humanities and the social sciences. Maybe there's a sort of context too, in terms of the neoliberal university, when we all have to be going for kind of funding and we all need to spend money and get money. You need to have a methodology in order to do that. And I do think there are some interesting questions about that. And it might be very different what happens when the money dries up, as it certainly is rapidly drying up in my own institution. So what kind of histories we'll write about and what kind of archives we'll have access to as a kind of infrastructure to these kinds of questions, I think is going to be interesting. So one of the things I was thinking too was, to date, have we seen, in a sense, more international legal historiography than we've seen international legal history from international lawyers? In a sense, is it an extension of a kind of broader international legal theoretical engagement? And because it's hard work writing those big histories. And in a sense, the temptation initially has been to write quite grand, not Whiggish histories, but big picture histories, right? I mean, international law sets out to kind of represent the world. It's a language for thinking about the world as a whole. And even when you take on board a kind of critical perspective, it's quite challenging without historical training as well, although some people do have that, to actually think about, a more micro level history. And I think that's what's really exciting about, or a thematic history in this regard, exciting about what Daniel and others are doing through focusing on particular objects like shipping containers and so on. They can begin to offer both and to tell us a little bit more than the kind of traditional accounts have done. So I know I don't want to take up all our time, but I have a couple of provocations. Do I have enough time, Sophie, to continue? So yeah, so a couple of questions that I have. So one of them is a pretty obvious broad question, which is, what might a future material history of international law look like? And I guess it's a bit unfair to ask that question, because Daniel then in subsequent chapters will start to sort of set out that for us. But I guess it was a good opportunity for me to kind of prod him further on what that future research will look like. So there's a promise in the title, obviously, of a material history as an alternative future. And I wonder, and this is something we've been asked about in terms of our exploratory sort of edited collection on international law and objects, is, how much of this is about new materialism and how much of it is about old materialism? And do we need to actually have a conversation between both old and new materialism? Because I do think there are sort of different concerns and debates that are there. And obviously, Daniel's referring to both, but I'm interested in that. Will this be a history focused on commodities or on infrastructure, or perhaps the symbolic function of things? So sometimes things, we're less interested in them as specific objects, and more or particular things are more interested in them as sort of meta objects or symbolic objects. And I think that particularly has been seen. So this Michael Farquhar's got that great book on, you know, sugar in international law, and I think there's quite a sort of productive avenue there. But also something that I've been thinking about in relation to the Objects Project too is the intention to give voice to new subjects who were once objects of international law. So in our project, a lot of what happened was that people kind of played with this idea of, you know, what's an object actually? And so a lot of our objects were kind of quasi-subjects. And maybe that's something that is of a particular interest to international lawyers too, in the sense that so many subjects have been excluded from international law traditionally, that, and in a sense were kind of, reified and traded and so on and exploited, that in a sense some of these new histories might in a sense recover the subjectivity of particular actors who may not actually appear to be objects at all or things. Also, what's in it for international lawyers? Like, why are they doing it? I mean, I've suggested a few different reasons, Daniel has as well, but I think that's quite interesting to think through. Because one of the things I was thinking about was, so Sam Moyne's recent history of human rights, So Not Enough, I've sort of dipped into it. I mean, sadly, I haven't read as widely yet the really recent literature as Daniel has, so it's really terrific to kind of be inspired to read more of it. For example, also Susan Marks has a kind of interesting new work, which I think is going to be really a kind of good text for you as well. In a sense, they're both offering different forms of intellectual history, but to actually still focus on the questions of distribution and structural inequality that that perhaps the sort of CLS-ish international lawyers might associate with a material term. So there is that kind of question as to, well, what's the sort of extra add-on benefit from sort of not doing intellectual history? And also here, I mean, I think it's really important to try to make the connections that you do, but what about the dangers of reading Marx and Foucault together? So I'm referring to, I think it's at page 5. And I'm interested to see how that's going to practically take shape in the way that you actually write the history that you write. So another thing, and maybe I'll wrap up here, is to think about whether this is an attempt at renewal, right? So how much of this interest in the material, this interest in history, and also in a sense, the synthesis offered by Daniel is driven by an attempt to renew a critical left or radical tradition within international legal scholarship and within historiography and within history too. So international law has some pretty murky historical origins, as we know. Now they're beginning to be more widely accepted within the scholarship. So how can this history inform our present concerns and debates about the future shape of international law? And in a sense, I guess, is this a call to self-reflect amongst the kind of International Legal Academy, or does it go further? And I think it does go further. I think that Daniel is kind of, in a sense, arguing for a renewal of a much longer radical tradition of international law on the left, one which I guess Susan Marks also has tried to articulate in her recent work and earlier work too. So look, I've got more comments and provocations, but let's wrap it there. And it's been a real pleasure to engage with the work, Daniel. I look forward to the discussion.
I just wanted to thank you. I think that you really nailed the issue that I'm really concerned about, and it's what you call the distinctiveness of law. I think that's something that it's been very troubling for me in many ways. And of course, I understand that this distinctiveness of law is a very powerful way to engage with our own discipline. But sometimes I have the feeling that we might be conceding too much to the traditional and, let's say, positivistic, as you mentioned before, ways to understand law. So Alain Potash has this great piece in which he wonders if the work done in materiality and legal theory hasn't been too hasn't conceded too much to the law's own sense of being. And that's something I'm very, very concerned. I would rather try to not presume that there is something that is instinctively legal and we should treat it with the solemnity of that, but rather what I'm trying to do is, okay, I'm going to ask questions of regulation. And even if they're not called law with a capital L, I'm going to try to pursue them and to see how that governs the world we live in. So as for your questions, what alternative histories, material histories could be done? My question is that many, and of course many beyond my own work is doing. If anything, I want to try to highlight, as you did very well in the book, that this is a great moment for plurality and diversity of approaches. And I don't want to come and say this is the approach to materiality, because I think there's so much interesting stuff being done. So in the next chapter, what I really do is to try to highlight all these different approaches. Some, for instance, use psychoanalysis to understand the relation between objects and subjects, and Israel's work in the book, for instance, a very good example of that. Some really take a Latour and action network theory, abandon la lettre, something that I'm not doing, as you can notice, and that's, for instance, what Andrew Lang does in the chapter in your book. My particular avenue, well, of course, there's this whole history of commodities, and you mentioned Michael Fakhri's great book on sugar. There's so much that could be done that I think this project initially began as a history of commodities project, and it started moving more towards a science and technology project. And what I mean with that is that I felt that STS really gave me the tools to not make the question between material and conceptual a chicken and egg problem. So it wasn't the material comes first and the ideas come later, or vice versa. But it was rather to understand what I would like to call dialectical, because I come from a Marx tradition, a relationship between the material, the ideological, the built and the imagined, the real and the possible. And I think that Shida's Jasanoff idea of socio-technical imaginaries really gives us a lot to go in that direction. So that's a little bit the work that I am trying to do. That's the way I would answer that question. It has, of course, many, many, many dangers. I completely agree with you. And it has been criticized by very strong Foucauldian scholars on the one hand and strong Marxist scholars on the other, that don't see that this overlap is possible. I think that reading is quite difficult. What I'm trying to suggest is that, and there's very interesting citations on this that Foucault made, is that even if he in practice tried to show his distance from Marxism, at the end, he was really using constantly Marxism in his own work. So of course, there's this whole debate, and Marxists say that discipline and punish has no theory of the state, and the whole debate with Polonzas, etc. But I think that behind that, there is a very sophisticated use of political economy in Foucault's work. And that's what I'm trying to do, is try to read how post-structuralist political economy would look like. And that is something that has a lot of problems, and we can talk about that further in the questions. As your question that what's the attempt of renewal, I think I would link this with what I said before on the distinctiveness of law. And I think really what is at the core of my work, and I haven't had I don't think I have the words yet to write this down, but it's a challenge to the idea that international law is a practice. It's something that I've been very comfortable with. You see this a lot. So law is a very specific kind of practice, and you wouldn't understand it unless you go to law school. And that happens both in the civil and the common law traditions. And what I'm trying to say is that that's not true. You know, disciplines is something we've invented in the last couple of centuries with very, very sophisticated and problematic methods. Let's not try to assume that training to be a lawyer is to be a barrister. I think that's only that only happens in law. No one assumes that a musician has to play an instrument. We all assume that being a law is about going and practicing to challenge. Thinking about law doesn't mean to have to practice law. That is more difficult to say than to do this. But with that, I will stop here and look forward to any comments and suggestions. This is very much a work in progress, so any suggestions are also more than welcome on how this piece could continue its work.
Um, Thank you, Daniel. So I will just have one suggestion. So yeah, I'm using the privilege to be the coordinator of the seminar. Yeah, so there is, so I worked a lot also in legal anthropology, and yeah, I worked a lot as a historian, as well as a legal anthropologist on the history of international law. And there is a reference which is really useful, and it's so by 2010 Stephen Greenblatt published Cultural Mobility, a manifesto to show the dialectic of cultural persistence and changes. And it's really, so it's on this political concept of translatio imperii, translation of empire. And I think it would be possible to use it as this political concept in materialism, implying, for example, the movement of law and political hegemony from one country to the next, or from one empire to the next. And you can see it, for example, how when you see it in the application of international law, you can see transfers. And I think it's really interesting to see it, to study it through the prism of Stephen Greenblatt, yeah, interpretation of cultural mobility. Yeah, Andrew. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so Andrew Levitas, Cambridge University. So thanks, Daniel. This is really, really good. And there's so much to dig into in terms of intellectual history, and so I come at it more as a historian. So I was fascinated by the sort of how you were approaching this subject. And when I think of the material history, the role of documents, circulations, archives, bureaucratic norms, kind of how documents help forge a kind of governed space almost, right? So what I was interested in is it seems like, you're reinvigorating a kind of radical reading of international law, kind of different, historical, intellectual lens to sort of examine law. And I'd like to sort of put it to you in one way and see how you respond. That the kind of project you're embarking on, it seems to be one part of sort of global history, but it's a very European, Eurocentric sort of vision of it. And I'm wondering how you sort of think about, or what's the sort of possibility of including different, like non-European, whether Asian or Arabic or other kind of legal traditions in a kind of broader re-examination, because it seems like what we're doing is continually retracing the same steps rather than sort of re-examining a more broader and contextual, maybe a richer history. So sorry, just what you think of that.
No, I think that's a great point, and I debated extensively with Sonia Pajuya when I was in Melbourne. There was a whole concern of her with my project. Is this is very Eurocentric? Where is the other in this narrative?
Yeah,
I think it's absolutely right, and it's particularly problematic because one thing that the new materialisms really offer us is a way to challenge the written text, which has been the predominant field of European and, let's say, North Atlantic forms of knowledge. And there's this whole tradition of knowledges we could really engage if we look at objects, at, let's say, oral history, and that is definitely missing. What I would reply is that it's quite, when I embark to do a history of international law, of course I am quite aware of the dangers of Eurocentrism in my own narrative, and much could be done about, let's say, trading practices of the non-European. But at this stage of my work, to see is, or what I want to show is, on the one hand, that thing that was a universal development in containerization is actually a very limited story of some white people in a weird place called Geneva and a weird place called the ISO doing weird things. And methodologically, those people that we engage with so much and that has given much is the Cambridge School, were really just a very, very particular school of thought that happened in England from this to this time. So that would be my response. I try to provincialize. That is not enough, and I hope that my work will be later more fair to the voice of the others. But for a master dissertations, this is the hill that I have taken, I guess.
Okay, thank you very much. Daniel Joyce, do you want also to answer on this question on deprovincializing the history of international law, or?
No, and I think it's a really critical question. I think Sundia is one of the kind of leading kind of proponents of trying to offer different, post-colonial history. It's hard though because I guess these are the challenges faced in all kinds of post-colonial history, but it's hard where there's the challenge of language, the challenge of kind of also the challenge of representativeness, if you like. And you see that I think there's a really interesting book by Anthea Ross that was kind of a sort of comparativist sort of perspective called International Law International. And even there, it's kind of like it achieves its kind of important goal of kind of trying to question the internationalism of international law or the universal, but through kind of the political tool of the United Nations Security Council, right, which is very unrepresentative in its own way. So, I mean, I think it's an ongoing challenge, but I just do think it's important. And I think over time, hopefully we'll see different stories told and also imaginative ways in which objects themselves might tell a different story. So in our project, people looked at, say, for example, like signatures on treaty documents and reinterpreted them and reread them, which really kind of blew out of the water the whole kind of traditional view of a particular kind of document that was consented to, etc. And so I think there's a lot of potential there, but I do think it's a challenging it's challenging, and participation is kind of one of the kind of techniques to kind of encourage more different voices to emerge.
Great, thank you. Daniel, does any one of you have another question? Otherwise, I would have one. No one, okay. Last week during the last session, we had like a debate on the epistemic community in London. And it was interesting because we had a presenter speaking about the archives and what she was reading through the archives. And then it was on the crimes against humanity and how the concept of crimes against humanity was discussed in London. And then I asked the question about how the racial question or how the colonial question impacted it. And she answered that she didn't see it through the archives. So the archives, so the discussions and the minutes of the meetings did not express did not reflect this kind of discussions. But the problem is that the people who were discussing in London were coming from Belgium, from former of France, for example, so from former colonial empires. And I think that what is missing in all these minutes, in all this, is also is as a silences is also on the it's very important to reframe this, to reflect the silences through the lines of the minutes or through the debates or through this treaty. And it's very important. And Daniel, it's a complicated question, but how would material history of international law, or how would the new materialism of international law could reflect these silences?
I think that's a brilliant question, and it really allows me to talk a little bit about what I'm thinking for my PhD here in Geneva. I will not continue the containers project, or I will at least not continue formally as a PhD project. I do want to finish the manuscript on my own, etc. But what I'm thinking, Sophie, and this really goes in hand with what we were discussing a couple of weeks ago, is a material history at the international meeting space, at the conference hall, at the negotiation table. And I think that once we shift the focus the minutes or the letters or the documents. Not to say that they're not important, of course, I want to draw extensively for these materials too, but I also want to highlight, as we saw in GH&IL's paper, well, the very banal, insignificant things that constrain and give resources to the people in those meetings. So who got a chair, who got water, who got translation, who got to ask questions, who, as we saw a couple of weeks ago, not even able to enter the room. I think those are very interesting material questions in the history of international law. So that's what I envision for the PhD. I want to basically tell the history of the conference hall from the early 20th century to the last, let's say, big summits of the late 90s. That is very much a project that still needs to rough its edges in a lot of ways, but I'll be happy to share more of my doubts as I continue working it, not only with you, but with all the participants of this seminar.
One of the things that I mean, just listening to you, Sophie and Daniel talking, that I was thinking of and that I'd thought to say and sort of decided not to for reasons of time, was that I think, and maybe this is a response as well to sort of Andrew's provocation and your question to me about that, is that I think one productive approach here has been to examine the presence and effects of international law in everyday life. And obviously Sundhya, who we've talked about, but also Luisa Slava have done that. And I guess they have introduced, I mean, particularly Lewis, I think it's interesting. He has a piece called Istanbul Vignettes. I don't know if people have seen that, but he tries to kind of, I guess, combine sort of an interest in the visual and photography with a sort of international sort of legal ethnography, which is itself focused on the city, but also quite spatial in its kind of awareness. And I guess what he's suggesting is that image making and thinking critically about the way we see international law in the world around us may help us to see differently. And I guess maybe that's part of the challenge. So one of the ways in which we can sort of draw into view a post-colonial perspective or critique is to ourselves try to see differently what the traditional kind of accounts have been. And so looking at kind of the way, in fact, that international law is everywhere in daily lives, sort of away from the UN and away from sort of some of the grander kind of architecture, is, I think, one really promising avenue. And, you know, and I guess that connects as well with this the sort of interests, like there's an interesting book by Ian Hurd, you know, the things that you can do with international law, and this idea of kind of working with international law in these different settings. And I think it's interesting to hear of Daniel's future project, which we've talked a little bit about, but I do think, like, for example, Isabel Ruhl and some others are also looking at the architecture of these spaces and looking spatial. I mean, I think post-COVID-19, the kind of spatial question is pretty interesting one. And obviously that's been important sort of over time, but it's taken on a different kind of resonance in the current moment. And part of that is also about addressing the digital as well. So as we are today, how that changes things, how that changes the archive, and what sort of, you know, in some ways it appears to be quite ethereal. You know, we talk about the cloud, etc., but we also know there's a sort of sweaty, hot kind of mess behind the cloud, and there's a sort of data cable infrastructure as well that it is in itself a way of ordering the world, right? If you think about sort of one belt, one road, etc., that's a way of governing through kind of infrastructure and through development. That's quite different in a sense to what's come before.